February 9th, 1945, somewhere over Wurgis, Germany. Captain Jim Browning's gloved hand tightened on the control stick of his P-51 Mustang as the silver blur of an Me-262 jet fighter slashed across his canopy. 2 missions. He had just 2 more missions before his second combat tour ended, and he could finally go home to his wife and young son, Leslie. But the Germans had other plans. "Bandits! 12 o'clock high!" The radio crackled with urgency. What happened next would be reconstructed years later from German eyewitness accounts and crash site investigations. In the swirling chaos of the dogfight, as Captain Don Botchke dove after the jets, Browning pressed his attack. The Me-262 turned hard. So did Browning. Too hard. Too close. In a fraction of a second, metal met metal in the sky. Both pilots, the American ace with 7 kills, and the German Oberstleutnant Freiherr von Riedesel, died instantly as their aircraft disintegrated and plummeted earthward in flames. On the ground near Wurgis, a German railway employee named Wilhelm Manrer heard the roar of guns, then an explosion. When he visited the crash site that evening, he found wreckage scattered across 400 meters. Among the twisted metal, he could make out letters on one piece, Zanki, actually Zarnki, the name stenciled on the borrowed Mustang Junior Miss that Browning flew that day. Jim Browning, the fun-loving pilot from Syracuse, Kansas, who named his own P-51 Gentleman Jim, would never complete those final 2 missions. August 10th, 1944, skies over Sens, France. 6 months earlier and 400 miles to the west, another captain from the same 363rd Fighter Squadron faced his own moment of truth. Captain Eddie Simpson, flying his P-51D Reluctant Rebel, was locked in a running dogfight with German fighters when disaster struck. In the violent ballet of aerial combat, his Mustang collided with Lieutenant Don Ferron's aircraft. Ferron didn't survive, but Eddie Simpson did, at least for 4 more days. The Orange, New Jersey native managed to bail out successfully, his parachute blossoming over the French countryside. Local Maquis resistance fighters found him first, spiriting him away before German patrols could capture him. For Simpson, this should have been the beginning of an escape story. American pilot evades capture, makes his way back to Allied lines, returns to combat. Instead, it became something far more remarkable. On August 14th, 1944, in the heart of the forest of Orléans, Simpson joined more than 200 French Maquis fighters as German forces closed in. He could have fled. He could have tried to reach Allied lines. He was a fighter pilot, after all, not a ground soldier. But Eddie Simpson had spent years training with the motto of the 357th Fighter Group. Yoxford Boys, they called themselves, named after the small English village near their base. They were a band of brothers, and Simpson understood what brotherhood meant. As dawn broke over the forest, German troops attacked. Simpson took up a rear guard position, buying precious time for the French resistance fighters to escape. The crackle of gunfire shattered the morning stillness. When it ended, Captain Edward K. Simpson lay dead among the trees, having given his life so that men he'd known for only days might live. To understand why these 2 men matter, why their story resonates across 8 decades, we must first understand what bound them together. In the spring of 1943, both Browning and Simpson arrived at the 363rd Fighter Squadron in Tonopah, Nevada. Fresh from flying school, both were assigned to the same flight, led by a young captain named Clarence Bud Anderson. They trained together in the ungainly P-39 Airacobra, learning formation, flying, gunnery, and the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat. Anderson would later recall Simpson as such a likable, easygoing person. He was a superb pilot and a team member, very dependable, always right there where you wanted him all the time. Of Browning, Anderson said, "He was an excellent pilot and honed his skills with great determination. He could always be depended upon to be there when you needed him. We were great friends. When the 357th Fighter Group deployed to England in November 1943, they transitioned to the aircraft that would become legend, the P-51 Mustang. With its distinctive profile and exceptional range, the Mustang could escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, American bombers wouldn't face the Luftwaffe alone. But success came at a terrible price. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe represented one of the most sustained and costly operations in military history. Day after day, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, targeting factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at these formations. This was where pilots like Browning and Simpson made their stand. Simpson flew his first P-51B, All-Away 2, named after a horse from back home. When the high school students of East Orange, New Jersey, raised money through war bond drives, they purchased a Mustang specifically for their local hero, Simpson's second aircraft, Flying Panther. The gesture illustrated something profound about what these young men represented. They weren't just soldiers. They were the embodiment of an entire nation's commitment to victory. Browning's Gentleman Jim became equally legendary. The nickname suited him perfectly. He was indeed a gentleman, though, as Anderson noted with affection, he had a small speck of the devil in him also. That combination of professionalism and spirit made him a natural leader. By the time he completed his first combat tour in August 1944, he had 5 confirmed victories. Simpson, meanwhile, had racked up 4.25 aerial kills. The quarter kill came from a shared victory, a common occurrence when multiple pilots engaged the same enemy aircraft. In the 357th Fighter Group's ledger books, these fractions represented not bureaucratic precision, but the reality of team fighting, victories achieved not by lone wolves, but by men who trusted each other with their lives. The numbers tell a stark story. The 8th Air Force lost over 4,000 heavy bombers during the war. More than 1,200 P-51 Mustangs failed to return from missions. Over 40,000 aircrew members were killed or went missing. Fighter pilots like Browning and Simpson faced odds that would terrify any rational person. Yet they kept flying. Why? The easy answer is duty. The deeper truth is more complex. These men understood that their missions had consequences that rippled far beyond their individual aircraft. Every bomber they escorted home meant 30 men who might see their families again. Every German fighter they shot down meant one less threat to the men flying in vulnerable formations. Every oil refinery destroyed meant fewer tanks and trucks for the Wehrmacht, fewer aircraft for the Luftwaffe. They were fighting what historians would later call a war of attrition, wearing down the enemy's capacity to resist through sustained pressure. It was brutal mathematics. It was also necessary. While Bud Anderson was home on leave in the summer of 1944, enjoying a brief respite from combat, Eddie Simpson continued flying missions over occupied France. On August 10th, during that fateful fighter sweep, his world changed in an instant. The details come to us through multiple sources: mission reports, German records, and most poignantly, from the French civilians who witnessed what happened next. Madame O'Neill, whose husband led the local maquis, remembered Simpson arriving late in the evening of August 10th. For 4 days, he stayed with the resistance fighters, moving through the ancient forest of Orléans. Then came August 14th, the day the French would remember as the day the maquis were attacked. German forces, hunting the resistance, surrounded the forest encampment. Simpson had a choice. The underground could have tried to smuggle him out separately, increasing his chances of reaching Allied lines. But that would have meant abandoning the men who'd saved him. It would have meant putting his own survival above theirs. Eddie Simpson made a different choice. Taking up a defensive position, he fought alongside the maquis as they conducted a fighting withdrawal. His covering fire allowed approximately 200 resistance fighters to escape to Allied lines. But Simpson himself fell during the action, killed by German soldiers. Years later, when his story finally came to light, the French erected a memorial at the site. His name appears on a monument dedicated to all who died in the Forest of Orléans during those dark days of occupation. For the French, Simpson wasn't just an American pilot who happened to be there. He was a hero who chose to be there, who could have fled but stayed to fight. It took 15 years for the American military to correct Simpson's official record of death, initially listed as August 10th, the day of the mid-air collision, rather than August 14th, the day he actually died. The confusion was understandable. In the chaos of war, accurate information was hard to obtain. But the delay meant that for years, even Simpson's own family might not have known the true circumstances of his death or understood the magnitude of his final act of courage. Jim Browning couldn't stay away from the fight. After completing his first combat tour in August 1944, he went home for the brief rest and recuperation period afforded to combat veterans. He could have requested a training assignment. He could have remained stateside. Instead, in November 1944, he volunteered to return to the 363 Fighter Squadron for a second tour. By February 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Allies had landed in Normandy, liberated France, and were pressing toward the Rhine. But the Germans weren't finished. They had one more card to play: jet aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me-262 represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. With speeds approaching 550 miles per hour, it could outrun any propeller-driven fighter. German pilots called it the Schwalbe, the Swallow. Allied pilots had less poetic names for the aircraft that seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike with devastating effect, and disappear before anyone could react. On February 9, 1945, Browning's squadron encountered Me-262s near Wurgis, Germany. Captain Don Bochke, flying with Browning, managed to shoot down 2 of the jets through a combination of skill, aggression, and luck, catching them during takeoff or landing when they were most vulnerable. But in the swirling fury of the dogfight, Browning and a German jet collided. The German pilot was Oberstleutnant Freiherr von Riedesel, an experienced officer. His rank, roughly equivalent to lieutenant colonel, suggests he was likely a unit commander, someone with significant combat experience. Both men died instantly. Adolf Keller, the Burgermeister of nearby Wursdorf, witnessed the collision from the ground. He later gave a statement to American investigators. On February 9, 1945, at noontime, I saw a dogfight in the vicinity of Wurgis. The German fighter rammed an airplane, and both of them caught fire and crashed down. A German sergeant brought Keller items recovered from Browning's wreckage: a gold ring, an ID tag bearing his name, a photograph with his name on it, and some currency. These personal effects, the small talismans that young men carried into combat, eventually made their way back to Browning's family, tangible proof of loss that no telegram could fully convey. Browning had been 2 missions shy of completing his second tour. 2 missions, perhaps 60 more hours of flying. Instead, he was gone, leaving behind a widow, a young son named Leslie, and a family in Syracuse, Kansas, who had already given so much to the war effort. Decades later, a man named James Edward Anderson would research these 2 pilots with particular dedication. Jim Anderson wasn't a historian by profession. He was the son of Clarence "Bud" Anderson, the triple ace who had led Browning and Simpson in training and combat, who had called them friends, who had seen them fly and fight and die. Bud Anderson named his son James Edward in honor of James Browning and Edward Simpson. Think about what that means. Imagine the weight of carrying those names, knowing that you exist as a living memorial to men who died before their time. Jim Anderson has spent years preserving their stories, maintaining websites, tracking down records, visiting crash sites, In 2015, two young German police officers, Andy and Yannick, used information from Jim Anderson's website to locate Browning's crash site near Wurgis. Using metal detectors, they found fragments of the P-51 scattered across a peaceful forest. An elderly German farmer remembered witnessing the crash as a boy and picking up one of the .50 caliber machine guns from the wreckage, only to be severely reprimanded by his parents and forced to turn it over to authorities. The officers contacted Jim Anderson, who traveled to Germany to visit the site where his namesake had fallen. There, in a forest that had grown over 7 decades, he stood where Jim Browning had fought his last battle. Eddie Simpson rests in the Epinal American Cemetery in France, one of 14 permanent World War II American cemeteries on foreign soil. His grave marker bears his name, rank, and the date of death that took 15 years to correct. Through the efforts of pilot Bill Overstreet and Captain Jeffrey Clemens, New Jersey eventually recognized Simpson with a proclamation and flew an American flag over the state capitol in his honor. Jim Browning's memory is preserved in multiple ways. Jack Roush, the NASCAR team owner and aviation enthusiast, restored a P-51D in Browning's honor, painting it as Gentleman Jim. The aircraft appears at air shows, a flying memorial to a fallen pilot. In 2021, a plaque was dedicated to Browning at the Syracuse, Kansas airport, bringing his story back to his hometown. To understand why Browning and Simpson matter, we must zoom out to see the larger picture they were part of. The 357th Fighter Group, the Yoxford Boys, flew their first combat mission in February 1944. By war's end in May 1945, they had destroyed 609 enemy aircraft in the air and another 106 on the ground, making them one of the highest-scoring fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. They produced multiple aces, including Bud Anderson, 16.25 victories, Captain John Kit Carson, 18.5 victories, and numerous others. But these numbers came at a terrible cost. The 357th lost 78 members during the war. 76 were pilots. Additionally, 70 pilots went down in enemy territory. 54 became prisoners of war, and 16 managed to evade capture. Only a fraction made it home without being shot down. Think about those statistics. If you were a pilot in the 357th Fighter Group, you had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of being shot down. Your odds of being killed in action were approximately 1 in 6. These weren't abstract probabilities. They were the lived reality for men like Browning and Simpson, who watched friends disappear from formation, who attended memorial services, who wrote letters home knowing that each mission might be their last. Yet they kept flying. Here's what makes this story different from typical World War II narratives. Most documentaries focus on either the big picture, grand strategy, famous battles, turning points, or on individual heroics. This story exists in the space between. It's about what air superiority actually cost and what it meant. By 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was decisive. German fighters struggled to challenge daylight bombing raids. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, not just in combat, but through the grinding attrition of losing pilots faster than they could be trained. This air superiority enabled D-Day. It enabled the advance across France. It strangled German oil production, grounded their tanks, and made their military logistic impossible. But air superiority wasn't a thing that simply existed. It was created, day by day, mission by mission, by men like Browning and Simpson. Every German fighter they shot down meant one fewer threat tomorrow. Every bomber they escorted home meant 30 more chances to hit strategic targets. The mathematics of war are brutal, but they're real. Simpson's 4.25 kills and Browning's 7 victories might seem modest compared to the double aces, but multiplied across hundreds of pilots flying thousands of missions, these numbers became overwhelming force. The Germans couldn't replace their losses. The Allies could. This is what makes their sacrifice meaningful in a way that transcends individual heroism. They were part of a system, a strategic approach to warfare that historians would later recognize as revolutionary. The long-range fighter escort concept that the P-51 Mustang enabled changed warfare forever. It meant that air forces could project power deep into enemy territory with acceptable losses. It meant that strategic bombing could work. Let's consider what might have been different without men like Browning and Simpson. Without effective fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign over Germany would have been unsustainable. The Luftwaffe would have inflicted prohibitive losses on bomber formations. The Allies would have been forced to rely more heavily on area bombing at night, with lower accuracy and effectiveness. Without sustained air attacks on German oil production, the Wehrmacht would have had more fuel for its tanks and trucks. The Luftwaffe would have been able to field more aircraft. The war might have lasted longer, costing thousands or even tens of thousands more lives. Without air superiority, D-Day would have been vastly more dangerous, possibly even impossible. German fighters and bombers could have attacked the invasion fleet and the beaches. The outcome might have been very different. These aren't abstract counterfactuals. They're the concrete consequences of what men like Browning and Simpson achieved. Their missions, the ones they flew and survived, and the final ones that killed them, had strategic consequences that shaped the war's outcome. But let's not lose sight of the human dimension in discussing strategy and consequences. Jim Browning had a wife and a young son. When he volunteered for that second combat tour, he knew the risks. He'd completed one tour. He'd seen friends die. He'd attended memorial services. He knew the odds. Yet, he went back anyway. Why? The easy answer is duty and patriotism. The fuller answer includes guilt. The guilt that combat veterans feel when they're safe, while their friends continue fighting. It includes loyalty to his squadron, to his flight leader Bud Anderson, to the mission they'd committed themselves to accomplishing. And yes, it includes that small speck of the devil that Anderson remembered, that aggressive spirit that makes some men natural warriors. Browning didn't have to die near Wurgis, Germany, on February 9th, 1945. The war was essentially won by then. Germany would surrender 3 months later. But those 3 months still mattered. Every mission that kept German fighters on the defensive was a mission that might save bomber crews. Every German fighter destroyed was one that couldn't attack the ground forces pushing into Germany. Eddie Simpson didn't have to die in the forest of Orleans on August 14th, 1944. He'd survived the mid-air collision. The French resistance would have tried to get him back to Allied lines, but he chose to stay and fight with the men who'd saved him. That choice, to honor a debt, to stand with comrades even though they weren't technically his comrades, speaks to something fundamental about character. The strategic bombing campaign that Browning and Simpson helped protect fundamentally changed warfare. Before World War II, air power was primarily tactical, supporting ground forces, attacking shipping, conducting reconnaissance. The concept of strategic bombing, destroying an enemy's capacity to wage war by attacking their industrial base, was theoretical. The 8th Air Force proved it could work, but only with effective fighter escort. Early unescorted raids suffered catastrophic losses. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang and the tactics developed by groups like the 357th changed everything. By 1945, German oil production had collapsed. Their synthetic fuel plants were rubble. Their transportation network was shattered. Their aircraft industry was struggling to produce planes faster than they were being destroyed, both in factories and in combat. This wasn't the result of one battle or one campaign. It was the cumulative effect of thousands of missions flown by tens of thousands of airmen, including the routine but dangerous bomber escort missions that men like Browning and Simpson flew repeatedly. The lessons learned shaped post-war air doctrine. The concept of achieving air superiority before conducting ground operations became fundamental to American military strategy. The Korean War, the Gulf War, and every subsequent conflict has begun with establishing air superiority. We can trace this doctrine directly back to the European theater in World War II. What can we learn from Browning and Simpson today? First, that strategic victories are built on individual sacrifices. The air superiority that enabled Allied victory didn't happen automatically. It was purchased with the lives of men like Browning and Simpson, mission by mission, day by day. Second, that character matters. Simpson didn't have to stand with the Maquis. Browning didn't have to volunteer for that second tour. They made choices based on principles, loyalty, duty, honor, that transcended self-interest. Third, that remembrance is a form of honor. Jim Anderson maintaining his father's website. The French preserving Simpson's memory at the Forest of Orleans Memorial. Jack Rouche restoring Gentleman Jim as a flying tribute. These acts of remembrance say that these lives mattered, that these sacrifices weren't in vain. Finally, that the price of freedom is paid by specific individuals with names and faces and families. It's easy to talk about the greatest generation in abstract terms. It's harder but more important to remember individual people like Jim Browning from Syracuse, Kansas, and Eddie Simpson from Orange, New Jersey, who never came home.